The Peninsular War, 1808–1814, b. was fought in the Iberian Peninsula by the Iberian nations Spain and Portugal, along with the United Kingdom, against the invading and occupying forces of the First French Empire during the Napoleonic Wars. In Spain, it is considered to overlap with the Spanish War of Independence. It overlapped with the War of the Fifth Coalition, 1809, and the War of the Sixth Coalition, 1812–1814. The war can be said to have started when the French and Spanish armies invaded and occupied Portugal in 1807 by transiting through Spain, but it escalated in 1808 after Napoleonic France occupied Spain, which had been its ally. Napoleon Bonaparte forced the abdications of Ferdinand VII and his father Charles IV, and then installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne and promulgated the Bayonne Constitution. Most Spaniards rejected French rule and fought a bloody war to oust them. The war on the peninsula lasted until the Sixth Coalition defeated Napoleon in 1814 and is regarded as one of the first wars of national liberation. It is also significant for the emergence of large-scale guerrilla warfare. In 1808, the Spanish army in Andalusia defeated the French at the Battle of Belaine, considered the first open-field defeat of the Napoleonic army on a European battlefield. Besieged by 70,000 French troops, a reconstituted national government, the Cortes, in effect a government in exile, fortified itself in the secure port of Cadiz in 1810. The British Army, under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, guarded Portugal and campaigned against the French, alongside the reformed Portuguese army, and provided whatever supplies they could get to the Spanish, while the Spanish armies and guerrillas tied down vast numbers of Napoleon's troops. In 1812, when Napoleon set out with a massive army on what proved to be a disastrous French invasion of Russia, a combined Allied army defeated the French at Salamanca and took the capital Madrid. In the following year, the coalition defeated King Joseph Bonaparte's army at the Battle of Vittoria, paving the way for victory in the war in the Iberian Peninsula. Pursued by the armies of Britain, Spain, and Portugal, Marshal Jean de Dieusoult, no longer getting sufficient support from a depleted France, led the exhausted and demoralized French forces in a fighting withdrawal across the Pyrenees during the winter of 1813–1814. The years of fighting in Spain were a heavy burden on France's imperial army. While the French won several battles, they were eventually defeated, as their communications and supplies were severely tested, and their units were frequently isolated, harassed or overwhelmed by Spanish partisans fighting an intense guerrilla war of raids and ambushes. The Spanish armies were repeatedly beaten and driven to the peripheries, but they would regroup and relentlessly hound and demoralize the French troops. This drain on French resources led Napoleon, who had unwittingly provoked a total war, to call the conflict the Spanish Ulcer, 1617. For France, the Peninsular War bogged down Napoleon's troops, which allowed the rest of Europe to challenge Napoleon once more, including in the War of the Fifth Coalition, the French invasion of Russia, and culminating in Napoleon's defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition. The war against Napoleon's occupation led to the Spanish Constitution of 1812, promulgated by the Cortes of Cadiz, later a cornerstone of European liberalism. Though victorious in war, France would never again threaten a full-scale invasion of Spain. The burden of war destroyed the social and economic fabric of both Portugal and Spain. And the following civil wars between liberal and absolutist factions ushered in revolts in Spanish America and the beginning of an era of social turbulence, increased political instability, and economic stagnation. 1807. Extortion of Portugal. The Treaties of Tilsit, negotiated during a meeting in July 1807, between Emperors Alexander I of Russia and Napoleon, concluded the War of the Fourth Coalition. With Prussia shattered and the Russian Empire allied with the First French Empire, Napoleon expressed irritation that Portugal was open to trade with Britain. 19. Pretexts were plentiful. Portugal was Britain's oldest ally in Europe. Britain was finding new opportunities for trade with Portugal's colony in Brazil. The Royal Navy used Lisbon's port in its operations against France, and he wanted to deny the British the use of the Portuguese fleet. Furthermore, Prince John of Braganza, regent for his insane mother Queen Maria I, had declined to join the Emperor's continental system against British trade. 20. Events moved rapidly. The Emperor sent orders on 19 July 1807 to his foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, to order Portugal to declare war on Britain, close its ports to British ships, detain British subjects on a provisional basis, and sequester their goods. After a few days, a large force started concentrating at Bayonne. 21. Meanwhile, the Portuguese government's resolve was stiffening, and shortly afterward Napoleon was once again told that Portugal would not go beyond its original agreements. Napoleon now had all the pretexts that he needed, while his force, the First Corps of Observation of the Gironde with Divisional General Jean-Andoche Junot in command, was prepared to march on Lisbon. After he received the Portuguese answer, he ordered Junot's corps to cross the frontier into Spain. 22. While all this was going on, France and Spain signed the secret Treaty of Fontainebleau. The document was drawn up by Napoleon's Marshal of the Palace Guerrilla Duroc and Eugenio Izquierdo, an agent for Manuel Gade. 23. The treaty proposed to carve up Portugal into three entities. Porto and the northern part was to become the Kingdom of Northern Lusitania under Charles II, Duke of Parma. The southern portion, as the Principality of the Algarves, would fall to God. The rump of the country, centered on Lisbon, was to be administered by the French. 24. According to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Junot's invasion force was to be supported by 25,500 Spanish troops. 25. On 12 October, Junot's corps began crossing the Bidasoa River into Spain at Irun. 22. Junot was selected because he had served as ambassador to Portugal in 1805. He was known as a good fighter and an active officer, although he had never exercised independent command. 23. Portrait of Prince John of Braganza. Portrait of Prince John of Braganza by Jean-Baptiste Debret, 1817. Portrait of Napoleon as King of Italy. Napoleon Bonaparte by Andrea Appiani, 1805. Spanish Dilemma. Further information. History of Spain, 1700–1810. By 1800, Spain was in a state of social unrest. Townsfolk and peasants all over the country, who had been forced to bury family members in new municipal cemeteries rather than churches or other consecrated ground, took back their bodies at night and tried to restore them to their old resting places. In Madrid, the growing numbers of afrancesados Francophiles at court were opposed by the majos, shopkeepers, artisans, tavern keepers and laborers who dressed in traditional style and took pleasure in picking fights with petameters, the young who styled themselves with French fashion and manners. 26. Spain was an ally of Napoleon's First French Empire. However, defeat in the naval battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, which had decimated Spain's navy, had removed the reason for alliance with France. Manuel Gade, the favorite of King Charles IV of Spain, began to seek some form of escape. At the start of the War of the Fourth Coalition, which pitted the Kingdom of Prussia against Napoleon, Gade issued a proclamation that was obviously aimed at France, even though it did not specify an enemy. After Napoleon's decisive victory at the Battle of Jena, Auerstedt, Gade quickly withdrew the proclamation. However, it was too late to avert Napoleon's suspicions. Napoleon planned from that moment to deal with his inconstant ally at some future time. In the meantime, the emperor forced God and Charles IV into providing a division of Spanish troops to serve in northern Europe. 27. The Division of the North spent the winter of 1807–1808 in Swedish Pomerania, Mecklenburg, and towns of the old Hanseatic League, and Spanish troops marched into Denmark in early 1808. 28. Portrait of Fernando, VII de España. Prince Fernando, VII of Spain by Vicente López Portaña. Portrait of Charles IV. King Charles IV of Spain by Francisco Goya. Invasion of Portugal. Main article, Invasion of Portugal, 1807. Painting shows crowds of people dressed in early 1800s clothing, getting off horse-drawn carriages near the sea. Transfer of the Portuguese court to Brazil, 1807. Napoleon instructed Junot, with the cooperation of Spanish military troops, to invade Portugal, moving west from Alcantara along the Tagus Valley to Portugal. A distance of only 120 miles, 193 km. 29. On 19 November 1807, the French troops under Junot set out for Lisbon and occupied it on 30 November. 30. The Prince Regent John escaped, loading his family, courtiers, state papers and treasure aboard the fleet, protected by the British, and fled to Brazil. He was joined in flight by many nobles, merchants, and others. With 15 warships and more than 20 transports, the fleet of refugees weighed anchor on 29 November and set sail for the colony of Brazil. 31. The flight had been so chaotic that 14 carts loaded with treasure were left behind on the docks. 32. As one of Junot's first acts, the property of those who had fled to Brazil was sequestered. 33. And a 100 million franc indemnity imposed. 34. The army formed into a Portuguese legion and went to northern Germany to perform garrison duty. 33. Junot did his best to calm the situation by trying to keep his troops under control. While the Portuguese authorities were generally subservient toward their French occupiers, the ordinary Portuguese were angry. 33. And the harsh taxes caused bitter resentment among the population. By January 1808, there were executions of persons who resisted the exactions of the French. The situation was dangerous, but it would need a trigger from outside to transform unrest into revolt. 34. 1808. Coup d'etat. Portrait of Manuel God, 1767–1851. Portrait of Manuel God by Francisco Bayeu y Subias, 1792. Joseph I of Spain by François Quinson, 1811. Between 9 and 12 February, the French divisions of the Eastern and Western Pyrenees crossed the border and occupied Navarre and Catalonia, including the citadels of Pamplona and Barcelona. The Spanish government demanded explanations from their French allies, but these did not satisfy, and in response God pulled Spanish troops out of Portugal. 35. Since Spanish fortress commanders had not received instructions from the central government, they were unsure how to treat the French troops, who marched openly as allies with flags flying and bands announcing their arrival. Some commanders opened their fortresses to them, while others resisted. General Guillaume Philibert Duhesme, who occupied Barcelona with 12,000 troops, soon found himself besieged in the citadel. He was not relieved until January 1809. 36. On 20 February, Joachim Murat was appointed lieutenant of the emperor and commander of all French troops in Spain, which now numbered 60, 00035 100, 36. On 24 February, Napoleon declared that he no longer considered himself bound by the Treaty of Fontainebleau. 35. In early March, Murat established his headquarters in Vitoria and received 6,000 reinforcements from the Imperial Guard. 35. On 19 March 1808, Godoy fell from power in the Mutiny of Aranjuez, and Charles IV was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Ferdinand Roman VII. 37. In the aftermath of the abdication, attacks on Godistas were frequent. 38. On 23 March, Murat entered Madrid with pomp. Ferdinand VII arrived on 27 March and asked Murat to get Napoleon's confirmation of his accession. 36. Charles IV, however, was persuaded to protest his abdication to Napoleon, who summoned the royal family, both kings included, to Bayonne in France. There on 5 May, under French pressure, the two kings both abdicated their claims to Napoleon. 37. Napoleon then had the Junta de Gobierno, the Council of Regency in Madrid, formally ask him to appoint his brother Joseph as King of Spain. The abdication of Ferdinand was only publicized on 20 May. 39. Iberia in revolt. Further information: Deuce de Mayo uprising. On 2 May, the citizens of Madrid rebelled against the French occupation. The uprising was put down by Joachim Murat's elite Imperial Guard and Mamluk cavalry, which crashed into the city and trampled the rioters. 40. In addition, the Mamelukes of the Imperial Guard of Napoleon fought residents of Madrid, wearing turbans and using curved scimitars, thus provoking memories of Muslim Spain. 41. The next day, as immortalized by Francisco Goya in his painting the 3rd of May 1808, the French army shot hundreds of Madrid citizens. Similar reprisals occurred in other cities and continued for days. Bloody, spontaneous fighting known as guerrilla, literally little war, broke out in much of Spain against the French as well as the ancient regime's officials. Although the Spanish government, including the Council of Castile, had accepted Napoleon's decision to grant the Spanish crown to his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the Spanish population rejected Napoleon's plans. 42. The first wave of uprisings were in Cartagena and Valencia on 23 May, Zaragoza and Murcia on 24 May, and the province of Asturias, which cast out its French governor on 25 May and declared war on Napoleon. Within weeks, all the Spanish provinces followed suit. 43. After hearing of the Spanish uprising, Portugal erupted in revolt in June. A French detachment under Louis-Henri Loison crushed the rebels at Evora on 29 July and massacred the town's population. The deteriorating strategic situation led France to increase its military commitments. By 1 June, over 65,000 troops were rushing into the country to control the crisis. 44. The main French army of 80,000 held a narrow strip of central Spain from Pamplona and San Sebastián in the north to Madrid and Toledo in the center. The French in Madrid sheltered behind an additional 30,000 troops under Marshal Bonadrian Junot de Montse. Junot's Junot's corps in Portugal was cut off by 300 miles, 480 km, of hostile territory, but within days of the outbreak of revolt, French columns in Old Castile, New Castile, Aragon, and Catalonia were searching for the insurgent forces. Joaquin Sorolla, Valencians prepare to resist the invaders by Joaquin Sorolla, 1884. Joaquin Sorolla, Valencians prepare to resist the invaders by Joaquin Sorolla, 1884. 2nd of May 1808. The defenders of Monteleon make their last stand by Joaquin Sorolla, 1884. 2nd of May 1808. The defenders of Monteleon make their last stand by Joaquin Sorolla, 1884. The 2nd of May 1808 by Goya, 1814. The 2nd of May 1808 by Goya, 1814. The 3rd of May 1808 French soldiers execute civilians by Goya, 1814. The 3rd of May 1808 French soldiers execute civilians by Goya, 1814. Conventional warfare. The Spanish army's triumph at Belen was the French Empire's first land defeat. The surrender of Belen by José Casado del Alisal. To defeat the insurgency, Pierre Dupont de L'Éding led 24,430 men south towards Seville and Cadiz. Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bessières moved into Aragon and Old Castile with 25,000 men, aiming to capture Santander and Zaragoza. Montse marched toward Valencia with 29,350 men, and Guillaume Philibert Duhesme marshaled 12,710 troops in Catalonia and moved against Girona, 4546. At the two successive combats of El Bruc outside Barcelona, local Catalan militia, the Miquelets, also known as Sumptants, defeated François Xavier de Schwarz's 4,000 troops. Guillaume Philibert Duhesme's Franco-Italian division of almost 6,000 troops failed to storm Girona and was forced to return to Barcelona. 47. 6,000 French troops under Charles Lefebvre Desnouettes attacked Zaragoza and were beaten off by José de Palafox y Melci's militia. 48 Montse's push to take Valencia ended in failure, with 1,000 French recruits dying in an attempt to storm the city. After defeating Spanish counterattacks, Montse retreated. 49 At the Battle of Medina de Rioseco on 14 July, Bessières defeated Cuesta and Old Castile returned to French control. Blake escaped, but the Spaniards lost 2,200 men and 13 guns. French losses were minimal at 400 men. 50. Bessières' victory salvaged the French army's strategic position in northern Spain. Joseph entered Madrid on 20 July 50, and on 25 July he was crowned King of Spain. 51. On 10 June, 5 French ships of the line anchored at Cadiz were seized by the Spanish. 52. Dupont was disturbed enough to curtail his march at Cordoba, and then on 16 June to fall back to Andujar. 53. Cowed by the mass hostility of the Andalusians, he broke off his offensive and was then defeated at Belain, where he surrendered his entire army corps to Castaños. The catastrophe was total. With the loss of 24,000 troops, Napoleon's military machine in Spain collapsed. Stunned by the defeat, on 1 August Joseph evacuated the capital for Old Castile, while ordering Verdier to abandon the siege of Zaragoza and Bessières to retire from Leon. The entire French army sheltered behind the Ebro. 54. By this time, Girona had resisted a second siege. Europe welcomed this first check to the hitherto unbeatable imperial armies. A Bonaparte had been chased from his throne. Tales of Spanish heroism inspired Austria and showed the force of national resistance. Belain set in motion the rise of the Fifth Coalition. 55. British intervention. Further information. British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Portuguese and British troops fighting the French at Vimero. Britain's involvement in the Peninsular War was the start of a prolonged campaign in Europe to increase British military power on land and liberate the Iberian Peninsula from the French. 56. In August 1808, 15,000 British troops, including the King's German Legion, landed in Portugal under the command of Lieutenant General Arthur Wellesley, who drove back Henry Francois de Laborde's 4,000-strong detachment at Rallissa on 17 August and smashed Junot's main force of 14,000 men at Vimero. Wellesley was replaced at first by Harry Byrd and then Hugh Dalrymple. Dalrymple granted Junot an unmolested evacuation from Portugal by the Royal Navy in the controversial Convention of Sintra in August. In early October 1808, following the scandal in Britain over the Convention of Sintra and the recall of the generals Dalrymple, Byrd, and Wellesley, John Moore took command of the 30,000-man British force in Portugal. 57. In addition, David Baird, in command of an expedition of reinforcements out of Falmouth consisting of 150 transports carrying between 12,000 and 13,000 men, convoyed by HMS Louis, HMS Amelia, and HMS Champion, entered Corunna Harbor on 13 October. 58. Logistical and administrative problems prevented any immediate British offensive. 59. Meanwhile, the British had made a substantial contribution to the Spanish cause by helping to evacuate some 9,000 men of La Romana's Division of the North from Denmark. 60. In August 1808, the British Baltic Fleet helped transport the Spanish division, except 3 regiments that failed to escape, back to Spain by way of Gothenburg in Sweden. The division arrived in Santander in October 1808, 61. Napoleon's invasion of Spain. La Bataille de Samosir by Louis-François, Baron Lejeune, oil on canvas, 1810. After the surrender of a French army corps at Belen and the loss of Portugal, Napoleon was convinced of the peril he faced in Spain. With his Armée d'Espagne of 278,670 men drawn up on the Ebro, facing 80,000 raw, disorganized Spanish troops, 62, Napoleon and his marshals carried out a massive double envelopment of the Spanish lines in November 1808. 63, Napoleon struck with overwhelming strength, and the Spanish defense evaporated at Burgos, Tudela, Espinosa, and Samosir. The junta was forced to abandon Madrid in November 1808 and resided in the Alcazar of Seville from 16 December 1808 until 23 January 1810. 64, Madrid surrendered on 1 December, and Joseph Bonaparte was restored to his throne. In Catalonia, Laurent Gouvion Saint-Cyr's 17,000-strong VII Corps besieged and captured Roses, destroyed part of Juan Miguel de Vives Feliu's Spanish army at Cartagena near Barcelona on 16 December, and routed the Spaniards under Conde de Caldex and Theodore von Reding at Molins de Rey. Corunna Campaign, 1808–1809. Death of Sir John Moore, 17 January 1809, Aquatint by William Heath, engraved by Thomas Sutherland. By November 1808, the British army led by Moore was advancing into Spain with orders to assist the Spanish army's fight against Napoleon's forces. 65. Moore decided to attack Soult's scattered and isolated 16,000-man corps at Carrion, opening his attack with a successful raid by Lieutenant General Pagot's cavalry on the French pickets at Sahagun on 21 December, 66–67. Abandoning plans to immediately conquer Seville and Portugal, Napoleon rapidly amassed 80,000 troops and debouched from the Sierra de Guadarrama into the plains of Old Castile to encircle the British army. Moore retreated for the safety of the British fleet at La Coruna, and Soult failed to intercept him. 68–69. The rearguard of La Romana's retreating force was overrun at Mansilla on 30 December by Soult, who captured Leon the next day. Moore's retreat was marked by a breakdown of discipline in many regiments and punctuated by stubborn rearguard actions at Benavent and Cacabelos. 70. The British troops escaped to the sea after fending off a strong French attack at Corunna, in which Moore was killed. Some 26,000 troops reached Britain, with 7,000 men lost over the course of the expedition. 71. The French occupied the most populated region in Spain, including the important towns of Lugo and La Coruna. 72. The Spanish were shocked by the British retreat. 73. Napoleon returned to France on 19 January 1809 to prepare for war with Austria, giving the Spanish command back to his marshals. 1809. Spanish Campaign, early 1809. Fall of Zaragoza. Saragossa, the assault on the Santa Ingracia Monastery by Louis-François Lejeune, oil on canvas, 1827. Zaragoza, already scarred from Lefebvre's bombardments that summer, was under a second siege that had commenced on 20 December. Lannes and Moncey committed 2 army corps of 45,000 men and considerable artillery firepower. Palafox's second defense brought the city enduring national and international fame. 74. The Spaniards fought with determination, endured disease and starvation, entrenching themselves in convents and burning their own homes. The garrison of 44,000 was left with 8,000 survivors, 500 of them ill, 71, but the Grand Armée did not advance beyond the Ebro. On 20 February 1809, the garrison capitulated, leaving behind burnt-out ruins filled with 64,000 corpses, of which 10,000 were French, 74-75. First Madrid offensive. The junta took over direction of the Spanish war effort and established war taxes, organized an army of La Mancha, signed a treaty of alliance with Britain on 14 January 1809, and issued a royal decree on 22 May to convene at Cortes. An attempt by the Spain's Army of the Center to recapture Madrid ended with the complete destruction of the Spanish forces at Uclés on 13 January by Victor's I Corps. The French lost 200 men, while their Spanish opponents lost 6,887. King Joseph made a triumphant entry into Madrid after the battle. Sebastiani defeated Cartago's army at Ciudad Real on 27 March, inflicting 2,000 casualties and suffering negligible losses. Victor invaded southern Spain and routed Gregorio de la Cuesta's army at Medellin near Badajoz on 28 March, 76, where Cuesta lost 10,000 men in a staggering defeat, while the French lost only 77. Liberation of Galicia. On 27 March, Spanish forces defeated the French at Vigo, recaptured most of the cities in the province of Pontevedra, and forced the French to retreat to Santiago de Compostela. On 7 June, the French army of Marshal Michel Ney was defeated in the Battle of Pont Sampio in Pontevedra by Spanish forces under the command of Colonel Pablo Morillo, and Ney and his forces retreated to Lugo on 9 June while being harassed by Spanish guerrillas. Ney's troops joined up with those of Soult, and these forces withdrew for the last time from Galicia in July 1809. Citation needed. French advance in Catalonia. In Catalonia, Saint-Cyr defeated Reading again at Valls on 25 February. Reading was killed and his army lost 3,000 men for French losses of 1,000. Saint-Cyr began the Third Siege of Girona on 6 May, and the city finally fell on 12 December. 78. Louis Gabriel Suchet's III Corps was defeated at Alcañiz by Blake on 23 May, losing 2,000 men. Suchet retaliated at Maria on 15 June, crushing Blake's right wing and inflicting 5,000 casualties. 3 days later, Blake lost 2,000 more men to Suchet at Belchite. Saint-Cyr was relieved of his command in September for deserting his troops. Citation needed. Second Portuguese Campaign. Marshal Jean de Soult at the First Battle of Porto by Joseph Boehm, 1840 or 1843. After Corunna, Soult turned his attention to the invasion of Portugal. Discounting garrisons and the sick, Soult's II Corps had 20,000 men for the operation. He stormed the Spanish naval base at Ferrol on 26 January 1809, capturing 8 ships of the line, 3 frigates, several thousand prisoners and 20,000 Brown Bess muskets, which were used to re-equip the French infantry. 79. In March 1809, Soult invaded Portugal through the northern corridor, with Francisco de Silveira's 12,000 Portuguese troops unraveling amid riot and disorder, and within 2 days of crossing the border at Monterrey. Soult had taken the fortress of Chaves. 80, swinging west. 16,000 of Soult's professional troops attacked and killed 4,000 of 25,000 unprepared and undisciplined Portuguese at Braga at the cost of 200 Frenchmen. At the First Battle of Porto on 29 March, the Portuguese defenders panicked, many attempting to flee alongside the city's residents south over the river Douro, to die in the Porto boat bridge disaster. Between 6,000 and 20,000 Portuguese soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Suffering fewer than 500 casualties, Soult had secured Portugal's second city, and with its valuable dockyards and arsenals intact, captured immense quantities of supplies. 81-82, Soult halted at Porto to refit his army before advancing on Lisbon. 83. Wellesley returned to Portugal in April 1809 to command the British Army, reinforced with Portuguese regiments trained by General Beresford. These new forces turned Soult out of Portugal at the Battle of Grigio, 10-11 May, and the Second Battle of Porto, 12 May, and the other northern cities were recaptured by General Silvera. Soult escaped without his heavy equipment by marching through the mountains to Orense. 84. Spanish Campaign, late 1809. Talavera Campaign. The Battle of Talavera by William Heath. With Portugal secured, Wellesley advanced into Spain to unite with Cuesta's forces. Victor's I Corps retreated before them from Talavera. 85. Cuesta's pursuing forces fell back after Victor's reinforced army, now commanded by Marshal Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, drove upon them. 2 British divisions advanced to help the Spanish. 86. On 27 July at the Battle of Talavera, the French advanced in 3 columns and were repulsed several times, but at a heavy cost to the Anglo-Allied force, which lost 7,500 men for French losses of 7,400. Wellesley withdrew from Talavera on 4 August to avoid being cut off by Soult's converging army, which defeated a Spanish blocking force in an assault crossing at the river Tagus near Puente del Arzobispo. Lack of supplies and the threat of French reinforcement in the spring led Wellesley, elevated to the peerage as Viscount Wellington following the action, 87, to retreat into Portugal. A Spanish attempt to capture Madrid after Talavera failed at Almanacid, where Sebastiani's IV Corps inflicted 5,500 casualties on the Spanish, forcing them to retreat at the cost of 2,400 French losses. Second Madrid Offensive. The Spanish Supreme Central and governing junta of the kingdom was forced by popular pressure to set up the Cortes of Cadiz in the summer of 1809. The junta came up with what it hoped would be a war-winning strategy, a 2-pronged offensive to recapture Madrid, involving over 100,000 troops in 3 armies under the Duke del Parc. Juan Carlos de Arriazaga and the Duke of Albuquerque, 88-89-90 del Parc defeated Jean-Gabriel Marchand's VI Corps at the Battle of Tamames on 18 October 1891, and occupied Salamanca on 25 October. 92. Marchand was replaced by François-Étienne de Kellerman, who brought up reinforcements in the form of his own men as well as general of brigade Nicolas Godinot's force. Kellerman marched on Del Parc's position at Salamanca, who promptly abandoned it and retreated south. In the meantime, the guerrillas in the province of Leon increased their activity. Kellerman left the VI Corps holding Salamanca and returned to Leon to stamp out the uprising. 93. Arriazaga's army was destroyed by Soult at the Battle of Ocaña on 19 November. The Spanish lost 19,000 men compared to French losses of 2,000. Albuquerque soon abandoned his efforts near Talavera. Del Parc moved on Salamanca again, hustling one of the VI Corps brigades out of Alba de Tormes and occupying Salamanca on 20 November, 94-95. Hopping to get between Kellerman and Madrid, Del Parc advanced towards Medina del Campo. Kellerman counterattacked and was repulsed at the Battle of Carpio on 23 November, 96. The next day, Del Parc received news of the Ocaña disaster and fled south, intending to shelter in the mountains of central Spain, 97-98. On the afternoon of 28 November, Kellerman attacked Del Parc at Alba de Tormes and routed him after inflicting losses of 3,000 men. 97. Del Parc's army fled into the mountains. Its strength greatly reduced through combat and non-combat causes by mid-January. 99. 1810. Joseph I's Regime. Main article, Spain under Joseph Bonaparte. Portrait of Joseph Bonaparte by François Gérard, 1808. Joseph contented himself with working within the apparatus extant under the old regime, while placing responsibility for local government in many provinces in the hands of royal commissioners. After much preparation and debate, on 2 July 1809 Spain was divided into 38 new provinces, each headed by an intendant appointed by King Joseph, and on 17 April 1810, these provinces were converted into French-style prefectures and sub-prefectures. The French obtained a measure of acquiescence among the propertied classes. Francisco de Goya, who remained in Madrid throughout the French occupation, painted Joseph's picture and documented the war in a series of 82 prints called Los Desastres de la Guerra, the disasters of war. For many imperial officers, life could be comfortable. 100. Among the liberal, republican, and radical segments of the Spanish and Portuguese populations, there was much support for a potential French invasion. The term afrancesado, turned French, was used to denote those who supported the Enlightenment, secular ideals, and the French Revolution. 101. Napoleon relied on support from these afrancesados, both in the conduct of the war and administration of the country. Napoleon removed all feudal and clerical privileges, but most Spanish liberals soon came to oppose the occupation because of the violence and brutality it brought. 101. Marxians wrote that there was a positive identification on the part of the people with the Napoleonic Revolution, but this is probably impossible to substantiate by the reasons for collaboration being practical rather than ideological. 102. Emergence of the guerrilla. Main article: Guerrilla warfare in the Peninsular War. Juan Martin Diaz, El Empecinado, a key guerrilla leader. The Peninsular War is regarded as one of the first people's wars, significant for the emergence of large-scale guerrilla warfare. It is from this conflict that the English language borrowed the word. 103. The guerrillas troubled the French troops, but they also frightened their own countrymen with forced conscription and looting. 104. Many of the partisans were either fleeing the law or trying to get rich. 104. Later in the war, the authorities tried to make the guerrillas reliable, and many of them formed regular army units such as Espadas y Minas, Cazadores de Navarra. The French believed that enlightened absolutism had made less progress in Spain and Portugal than elsewhere, and that resistance was the product of a century's worth of what the French perceived as backwardness in knowledge and social habits, Catholic obscurantism, superstition, and counter-revolution. 105. The guerrilla style of fighting was the Spanish military's single most effective tactic. Most organized attempts by regular Spanish forces to take on the French ended in defeat. Once a battle was lost, and the soldiers reverted to their guerrilla roles, they tied down large numbers of French troops over a wide area with a much lower expenditure of men, energy, and supply citation needed. 104, and facilitated the conventional victories of Wellington and his Anglo-Portuguese army, and the subsequent liberation of Portugal and Spain. 106. Mass resistance by the people of Spain inspired the war efforts of Austria. Russia and Prussia against Napoleon. 107. Hatred of the French and devotion to God, king and fatherland were not the only reason to join the partisans. 108. The French imposed restrictions on movement and on many traditional aspects of street life, so opportunities to find alternative sources of income were limited. Industry was at a standstill, and many seigneurs were unable to pay their existing retainers and domestic servants, and could not take on new staff. Hunger and despair reigned on all sides. 109. Because the military record was so dismal, many Spanish politicians and publicists exaggerated the activities of the guerrillas. 110. Revolution under sea. Further information: Siege of Cadiz. The Proclamation of the Constitution of 1812 by Salvador Vinegra. The French invaded Andalusia on 19 January 1810. 60,000 French troops, the corps of Victor, Mortier, and Sebastiani together with other formations, advanced southwards to assault the Spanish positions. Overwhelmed at every point, Arriazaga's men fled eastwards and southwards, leaving town after town to fall into the hands of the enemy. The result was revolution. On 23 January, the Junta Central at Seville decided to flee to the safety of Cadiz. 111. It then dissolved itself on 29 January 1810 and set up a 5-person Regency Council of Spain and the Indies, charged with convening the courts. 64. Soult cleared all of southern Spain except Cadiz, which he left Victor to blockade. 112. The system of juntas was replaced by a regency and the Cortes of Cadiz, which established a permanent government under the Constitution of 1812. Cadiz was heavily fortified, while the harbor was full of British and Spanish warships. Albuquerque's army and the Voluntarios Distinguidos had been reinforced by 3,000 soldiers who had fled Seville, and a strong Anglo-Portuguese brigade commanded by General William Stewart. Shaken by their experiences, the Spaniards had abandoned their earlier scruples about a British garrison. 113. Victor's French troops camped at the shoreline and tried to bombard the city into surrender. Thanks to British naval supremacy, a naval blockade of the city was impossible. The French bombardment was ineffectual, and the confidence of the Gaditanos grew and persuaded them that they were heroes. With food abundant and falling in price, the bombardment was hopeless despite both hurricane and epidemic. A storm destroyed many ships in the spring of 1810, and the city was ravaged by yellow fever. 114. Once Cadiz was secured, attention turned to the political situation. The Junta Central announced that the Cortes would open on 1 March 1810. Suffrage was to be extended to all male householders over 25. After public voting, representatives from district-level assemblies would choose deputies to send to the provincial meetings that would be the bodies from which the members of the Cortes would emerge. 115. From 1 February 1810, the implementation of these decrees had been in the hands of the new Regency Council selected by the Junta Central. 116. The viceroyalties and independent captaincies general of the overseas territories would each send one representative. This scheme was resented in the Americas for providing unequal representation to the overseas territories. Unrest erupted in Quito and Charcas, which saw themselves as the capitals of kingdoms, and resented being subsumed in the larger kingdom of Peru. The revolts were suppressed. See Luz de America and Bolivian War of Independence. Throughout early 1809, the governments of the capitals of the viceroyalties and captaincies general elected representatives to the junta, but none arrived in time to serve on it. Third Portuguese Campaign. Further information: Lines of Torres Vedras. Silver coin, 1,000 Reis Manuel II of Portugal, 1910, commemorating the Peninsular War. View of gun emplacements. Fortalezas, site of the Battle of Sobral. Peninsular War is located in Portugal. Lisbon, Evora, Rallicer, Vimiro, Chaves, Braga, Grigio, Porto, Almeida, Basaco, Sobral, Teixeira, Torres, Vedras, Pombal, Redinha, Sabugal, Fuentes de Añor. Peninsular War, Portugal. 1807, 1808, 1809, 1810, 1811. Convinced by intelligence that a new French assault on Portugal was imminent, Wellington created a powerful defensive position near Lisbon, to which he could fall back if necessary. 117-118 full citation needed. To protect the city, he ordered the construction of the lines of Torres Vedras, 3 strong lines of mutually supporting forts, blockhouses, redoubts, and ravelins with fortified artillery positions, under the supervision of Richard Fletcher. The various parts of the lines communicated with each other by semaphore, allowing immediate response to any threat. The work began in the autumn of 1809, and the main defenses were finished just in time 1 year later. To further hamper the enemy, the areas in front of the lines were subjected to a scorched earth policy. They were denuded of food, forage, and shelter. 200,000 inhabitants of neighboring districts were relocated inside the lines. Wellington exploited the facts that the French could conquer Portugal only by conquering Lisbon, and that they could in practice reach Lisbon only from the north. Until these changes occurred, the Portuguese administration was free to resist British influence, Beresford's position being rendered tolerable by the firm support of the Minister of War, Miguel de Pereira Forges. 119. As a prelude to invasion, Ney took the Spanish fortified town of Ciudad Rodrigo after a siege lasting from 26 April to 9 July 1810. The French reinvaded Portugal with an army of around 65,000, led by Marshal Massena, and forced Wellington back through Almeida to Busaco, 120. At the Battle of the Coa, the French drove back Robert Craufurd's light division, after which Massena moved to attack the held British position on the heights of Busaco, a 10-mile, 16 km, long ridge, resulting in the Battle of Busaco on 27 September. Suffering heavy casualties, the French failed to dislodge the Anglo-Portuguese army. Massena outmaneuvered Wellington after the battle, who steadily fell back to the prepared positions in the lines. 121 Wellington manned the fortifications with secondary troops. 25,000 Portuguese militia, 8,000 Spaniards and 2,500 British Royal Marines and Royal Artillerymen, keeping his main field army of British and Portuguese regulars dispersed to meet a French assault on any point of the lines. 122. Massena's army of Portugal concentrated around Sobral in preparation to attack. After a fierce skirmish on 14 October in which the strength of the lines became apparent, the French dug themselves in rather than launch a full-scale assault, and Massena's men began to suffer from the acute shortages in the region. 123. In late October, after holding his starving army before Lisbon for a month, Massena fell back to a position between Santarém and Rio Mare. 124. 1811. Stalemate in the West. During 1811, Victor's force was diminished because of requests for reinforcement from Soult to aid his siege of Badajoz. 125. This brought the French numbers down to between 20,000 and 15,000 and encouraged the defenders of Cadiz to attempt a breakout. 125. In conjunction with the arrival of an Anglo-Spanish relief army of around 12,000 infantry and 800 cavalry under the overall command of Spanish General Manuel La Peña, with the British contingent being led by Lieutenant General Thomas Graham. 126 marching towards Cadiz on 28 February. This force defeated two French divisions under Victor at Barossa. However, the Allies failed to exploit their success, and Victor soon renewed the blockade. 127 from January through March 1811. Soult with 20,000 men besieged and captured the fortress towns of Badajoz and Olivenza in Extremadura, capturing 16,000 prisoners, before returning to Andalusia with most of his army. Soult was relieved at the operation's speedy conclusion, for intelligence received on 8 March told him that Francisco Ballesteros' Spanish army was menacing Seville, that Victor had been defeated at Barossa, and that Massena had retreated from Portugal. Soult redeployed his forces to deal with these threats. 128. In March 1811, with supplies exhausted, Massena retreated from Portugal to Salamanca. Wellington went over to the offensive later that month. An Anglo-Portuguese army led by the British general William Beresford and a Spanish army led by the Spanish generals Joaquin Blake and Francisco Castaños attempted to retake Badajoz by laying siege to the French garrison Soult had left behind. Soult regathered his army and marched to relieve the siege. Beresford lifted the siege and his army intercepted the marching French. At the Battle of Albura, Soult outmaneuvered Beresford but could not win the battle. He retired his army to Seville. 129. In April, Wellington besieged Almeida. Massena advanced to its relief, attacking Wellington at Fuentes de Oñoro, 3-5 May. Both sides claimed victory, but the British maintained the blockade, and the French retired without being attacked. After this battle, the Almeida garrison escaped through the British lines in a night march. 130. Massena was forced to withdraw, having lost a total of 25,000 men in Portugal, and was replaced by Auguste Marmont. Wellington joined Beresford and renewed the siege of Badajoz. Marmont joined Soult with strong reinforcements, and Wellington retired. 131. Wellington soon appeared before Ciudad Rodrigo. In September, Marmont repelled him and reprovisioned the fortress. 132 sorties continued to be made out of Cadiz from April to August 1811, 133, and British naval gunboats destroyed French positions at St. Mary's, 134. An attempt by Victor to crush the small Anglo-Spanish garrison at Tarifa over the winter of 1811-1812 was frustrated by torrential rains and an obstinate defense, marking an end to French operations against the city's outer works. The Battle of Chiclana, 5th March 1811, 1824, captures the fight between British redcoats and the French troops for Barossa Ridge. 16. The Battle of Chiclana, 5th March 1811, 1824, captures the fight between British redcoats and the French troops for Barossa Ridge. 16. Marshal Beresford disarming a Polish officer at La Albura. 16 May 1811. Marshal Beresford disarming a Polish officer at La Albura. 16 May 1811. French conquest of Aragon and Catalonia. After a 2-week siege, the French army of Aragon under its commander, General Suchet, captured the town of Tortosa from the Spanish in Catalonia on 2 January 1811. MacDonald's VII Corps was defeated in a vanguard skirmish at El Pla. The Spanish commander Francesc Rivera captured in Acuti-Main the key fortress of St. Ferran Castle at Figueres with 2,000 Miquelets on 10 April. The French army of Catalonia under MacDonald blockaded the city to starve the defenders into surrender. With the help of a relief operation on 3 May, the fortress held out until 17 August, when lack of food prompted a surrender after a last-ditch breakout attempt failed. 135. On 5 May, Suchet besieged the vital city of Tarragona, which functioned as a port, a fortress, and a resource base that sustained the Spanish field forces in Catalonia. Suchet was given a third of the Army of Catalonia, and the city fell to a surprise attack on 29 June, 136. Suchet's troops massacred 2,000 civilians. Napoleon rewarded Suchet with a marshal's baton. On 25 July, Suchet drove the Spanish out of their positions on the Montserrat mountain range. In October, the Spanish launched a counterattack that recaptured Montserrat and took 1,000 prisoners from scattered French garrisons in the area. In September, Suchet launched an invasion of the province of Valencia. He besieged the castle of Sagunto and defeated Blake's relief attempt. The Spanish defenders capitulated on 25 October. Suchet trapped Blake's entire army of 28,044 men in the city of Valencia on 26 December, and forced it to surrender on 9 January 1812 after a brief siege. Blake lost 20,281 men dead or captured. Suchet advanced south, capturing the port town of Dania. The redeployment of a substantial part of his troops for the invasion of Russia ground Suchet's operations to a halt. The victorious Marshal had established a secure base in Aragon and was ennobled by Napoleon as the Duke of Albufera, after a lagoon south of Valencia. The war now fell into a temporary lull, with the superior French unable to find an advantage and coming under increasing pressure from Spanish guerrillas. The French had over 350,000 soldiers in l'Armée de l'Espagne, but over 200,000 were deployed to protect the French lines of supply, rather than as substantial fighting units.